Type of imperialism in Africa. Expansion fueled by capitalist industrialism and nationalism, but previously unsubjugated lands under European control during the 19th century. At its height, the British Empire alone consisted of over a quarter of the world's land mass and people. By 1914, Europe, together with its colonial possessions, occupied more than 80% of the globe. The conquest of Africa provided perhaps the clearest example of what is sometimes called the New Imperialism, an era roughly beginning in Africa in the 1880s and continuing into the 20th century. The New Imperialism was characterized by a frantic competition among European nations to gobble up as much of the world map as possible. This led these nations into conflicts with native people and with each other. Before 1880, only 10% of Africa was controlled by European powers. By 1900, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained free of European control. The type of imperialism that ruled Africa was the colonial imperialism. This form of imperialism is verbal complete takeover of an area with domination in all areas: economic, political, and social-cultural. The subjugated area existed to benefit the imperialist power and had almost no independence of action. In this era, almost all of Africa and southern and southeast Asia also were colonized.
There are several reasons why the European nations competed with each other to gain colonies in Africa. They all wanted to gain power and prestige. The more territory that they were able to control in Africa, the more powerful and important they thought they could become. Africa was tremendously rich in natural resources, which could be brought to Europe and turned into manufactured goods. Europeans also needed markets for their manufactured goods. These goods could be sold in Africa for large profits. Often, a European nation would take over territory in Africa simply to prevent another European country from taking it. Europeans wanted colonies to secure sources of raw materials, especially cotton, copper, iron, and rubber, that were used to fuel their growing industrial economies. And in addition to providing the motive for imperialism, European industrialization also provided the means. Europeans had keen interest in Africa's raw material, especially from those of West Africa: peanuts, timber, hides, and palm oil. Earlier in the 19th century, Europeans had profit from the slave trade in this region of Africa. Central African territories were soon added to the list of European colonies.
Countries in Africa. During the New Imperialism, there were 23 colonies in Africa, which were owned by 7 major countries. England had the most colonies with 5, but France had also a big territory in Africa, in the northwest. Africa had 2 independent states, Abyssinia and Liberia, Abyssinia in the east and Liberia in the west. Other countries which also had colonies in Africa were Germany, Portugal, Italy, Belgium, and Spain. After African independence, France's territory was divided into 7 new independent states, which are Tunisia, Algeria, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and Chad. Also, England territory was also divided into 7: Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Botswana, and South Africa. The 2 independent states were the same, although Abyssinia changed its name to Ethiopia. Belgian colony, named Belgian Congo, is now called Democratic Republic of Congo. And the other colonies also changed their name, although not their position.
African resistance to imperialism. after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, at which the most powerful European countries agreed upon rules for laying claim to particular African territories. The British, French, Germans, Italians, Spanish, Belgians, and Portuguese set about formally implementing strategies for the long-term occupation and control of Africa. Utopia stands alone, however, as the African society to successfully defend itself against an invading European army and remain free of direct European political domination. Menelik, second emperor of Ethiopia, led his army to accomplish this unique feat in March 1896, defeating General Oreste Barateri's Italian army and its Eritrean allies at the Battle of Adwa. Yet, as he conquered African territory and engaged in conflicts with African competitors, the French pushed deeper into the West African interior from Senegal under the direction of Louis Heidelberg and his northward through Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast with a large contingent of Hausa soldiers. Struggles with maintaining political autonomy and control over culture created tension with African societies and between the colonial administration and Africans through Africa, often leading to subtle forms of resistance as African individuals and groups sought to remove themselves from the colonial sphere of influence rather than challenge it.
Some of the effects of the new imperialism in Africa were positive, but the majority of them were negative. Some of the positive effects were introduction of technological advances. The new ability of Europeans in the 19th century to conquer other continents stemmed from a few inventions. The application of steam and iron to riverboats starting in 1820. Also the fact that the steamships, railways, and telegraphs allowed the Europeans to control the acquired colonies efficiently. In the European side was the gain on natural resources, such as rubber, petroleum, manganese, and palm oil for the machinery. Also, a new system of administration in the country gave Africa a more structured political system. Among the negative effects, which primarily were racism and the economic exploitation, in almost all instances the products sold to international markets were agricultural or forest products grown or collected for export to Europe. Even when slaves were no longer exported, slavery and other forms of labor remained essential to the production of transport of the commodities. European colonial rule in Africa following the Berlin Conference also needs to be understood against the backdrop of several centuries of the Atlantic slave trade, the rise of an African merchant class, and the penetration of merchant capital prior to 1900s. Economic exploitation led the white South African workers to receive the higher paid and less dangerous works, leaving the black South Africans to risk their lives down in the mines for limited pay.
We have the African perspective. In the moment that it happened, seemed as the best option and the right thing to do to the Africans, because the Europeans promised them that they were going to divide the land in equal territories, and the Africans could work in them getting the same quality of goods as the ones that conquered them. It was until later that they realized the only reason of the Europeans to conquer the Africans was for the land's goods where they lived in, and because their working labor was more resistant than the European one. We also have the European perspective. To Europe, imperialism was a way to obtain whatever they wanted in a relatively easy way, because the only thing that they needed to do was to divide equally the land and working labor, so in that way they could gain a lot of money Also, they saw an opportunity to expand because they were much more advanced than Africans, so it was easier to impose their beliefs, culture, and language.